To prevent the prisoner from faking his death, the warden burned his neck with a flame, but the old man showed no response after a long time. Seeing this, the warden ordered his men to dispose of the body. The guards covered the corpse with fruit cloths, planning to remove it after their meal, unaware that another prisoner in the tunnel had witnessed everything. As soon as the guards left, the man eagerly climbed out, devastated to see his cellmate of 8 years now separated by life and death. Realizing that dying in this prison was his fate, he swept his eyes over the old man's body and suddenly had a bold idea taking shape in his mind. He quickly tore open the fruit bag, dragged the corpse to his cell, positioned it on the bed as if sleeping, cut off his own hair and stuck it on the old man's head, disguising the body to look more like himself. After setting it up, the man crawled back to the old man's cell and found the treasure map hidden in the wall. Before the guards returned, he sewed himself into the fruit bag, leaving the rest to fate. Soon, the guards came back from their meal, and though the corpse felt heavy as they lifted it, they didn't suspect anything, leaving the fruit bag unopened. Just to be safe, they tied an iron ball to the ankles and threw the body into the sea together. Thanks to the knife the old man had made, the man cut a hole, broke free from the bag, untied the iron ball letting it sink, and struggled towards the light, unshackled. After 14 years of wrongful imprisonment, the man had finally escaped, but the danger wasn't over. He had to reach shore before the guards discovered him. Meanwhile, the guard delivering food sensed something was off when the man didn't respond to his calls, and upon closer look, was horrified to find the old man thrown into the sea lying on the bed. The warden had his men open the bed, easily cutting through the wall stones, and shining a torch inside, revealed a tunnel before their eyes. But it was too late. The man swam ashore with newfound strength, set on revenge. His friend had framed him and seized his wife while he was in prison. Now his enemy lived in luxury while he'd suffered 15 years in jail. Before revenge, he had to ditch his prison clothes or risk capture. He snuck into a farm and with the owner away, quickly changed into some fitting clothes. Seeing his haggard reflection, anger grew. Prison had aged the once handsome youth. It was all their fault. Next day, he returned home disguised, hoping to see his father. A neighbor revealed he'd passed years ago. Following the neighbor's directions, he reached the church. The caretaker led him to a grave. He learned his father died of grief. Shockingly, a nearby grave bore his own name. To his enemies, he was dead. Worse, they'd indirectly caused his father's death. Another blow awaited. Arriving at his wife's home, he discovered she'd remarried and moved to Paris. Reeling from these shocks, he wandered the streets in a daze. Suddenly, he spotted guards and hid. Discovery would spell disaster. Just then, a prisoner suddenly turned and fled. A guard chased after him, catching up near the man. The prisoner was knocked down and beaten severely. The man, also a prisoner, couldn't bear it. He swiftly knocked out the guard, then unlocked the prisoner's shackles and told him to leave quickly. But this guy stuck to him like glue. They hid in a carriage when guards appeared again. He learned the other was a smuggler, hence the guard's interest. The ship was docked, but he couldn't sail it. The man, a former captain, realized he could easily navigate the vessel. They reached the cargo ship with the smuggler's nephew. Destination, Taramane. The man checked instruments, noting an approaching storm. They'd seek shelter at Monte Cristo Island. The young man had no choice but to agree, unable to sail himself. At Monte Cristo, the man sought the Count's treasure. He pretended to hunt while surveying the land. The map from the priest seemed inaccurate. 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35. No matter where he went, he ended up at a cliff. As he pondered, the young man approached, inviting him to continue their journey. The weather was clear, so they needed to hurry. He had to postpone his search and return in a few days. As he boarded, he glimpsed the hilltop and noticed two massive rocks with what seemed like a door beneath. He quietly noted the location. Soon, they reached shore, first feasting at the harbor, then indulging in song, dance, and philosophical discussions. That night, the man couldn't shake the thought of what might be hidden under those boulders. He returned to Monte Cristo by boat. After searching, he indeed found a door, and upon inspecting the rocks above, a cave entrance appeared. He eagerly entered, discovering the Count's treasure, chests full of gold, silver, and precious jewels. The man was elated. This fortune would be key to his revenge plan. Days later, now the Count of Monte Cristo, he visited a church to repent before God, knowing his path of vengeance would inevitably lead to bloodshed. After confession, he sent the young man a gift: 2 ships, 3 houses, and an invitation to the Hotel Plantagenet in Marseille. His goal was simple: recruit talent. Revenge alone would be too difficult. He then sent the farmer a large sum, claiming it was for clothes. The farmer was stunned. It could buy hundreds of outfits. Soon, the two met again. The man immediately expressed his desire to hire him, explaining there'd be dangerous tasks ahead, but in return, he'd receive considerable payment. To ensure loyalty, the man shared his story of unjust imprisonment and escape, along with other experiences. Arthur agreed without hesitation, as this man was his savior. They visited the police to investigate Villefort, the prosecutor who framed him. Surprisingly, he'd become the royal prosecutor in Paris. The man wasn't angry, he seemed oddly at ease. To uncover the truth, he risked going to the police station, hoping no one would recognize him. He quickly reached the archives, telling staff he worked for the Paris Journal, tasked with writing about political prisoners. He claimed to have found a prisoner, Edmond Dante, who was jailed without trial and wanted to check his file for inspiration. However, his request was immediately denied. The staff stated it was confidential information. When they heard Welf's name, the staff tensed up and quickly apologized, saying they didn't know he was Inspector Weroff's man. That's how he managed to get the file. After the other person left, he immediately opened it. Inside was a report letter. As he read it, he fell into deep thought. This was the thread that would convict him and send him to prison unjustly. It wasn't signed but mentioned Cardrou's Tavern. The man couldn't understand why the tavern owner, who had no quarrel with him, would write this report. He then put the letter in his bag and returned the file with the newspaper inside, casually handing it back to the staff. After leaving the police station, he immediately took Arthur to Cardrou's Tavern. He wanted answers, but the person no longer worked there. 4 years ago, he'd sold the tavern and opened a small inn. They had to hit the road again, arriving at the inn. The owner didn't recognize him at first, as the man had changed a lot. So he showed him the report letter. The owner wasn't surprised by the letter. Only when the man introduced himself did he realize it was Edmond, thought dead for years. He begged for mercy, asking not to be killed. He claimed he was forced to write the letter, only responsible for sending it to the police. The man then asked who was behind it. He had to tell the truth. Glas and Fernand wrote it. He wanted to stop them, as the charges were false, but they threatened him. The man was furious, realizing these false accusations led to his unjust 15-year imprisonment, living a half-life. The owner knew he'd returned for revenge, so he quickly begged for mercy, saying, "I've been caring for your father until he passed away." He even produced some of the man's personal belongings. The man was confused. He understood Glas' accusations as he'd taken his captain role, but why did Fernand act similarly? The boss was shocked. "Don't you know? Fernand married your wife, Mercedes. They're living leisurely in Paris." Hearing this, the man was devastated. Even his beloved wife betrayed him. They were once so in love. He then learned from the boss that even his and his father's graves were erected by Fernand. The man couldn't understand. He was just imprisoned, so why did they all act as if he was dead? After calming down, he returned to the tavern, offering the boss a chance to redeem himself by joining his revenge plan. The boss readily agreed, not wanting to make another mistake. Now Glas a successful banker, while Fernand entered politics, becoming a count last year. He asked the boss to investigate them in Paris, along with prosecutor Villefort. This man was jailed without trial. Clearly there's a connection between the three. From now on, Edmond Dante would cease to exist. Only the vengeful Count of Monte Cristo remained. Cardrou's secret investigation uncovered a shocking secret that would ruin prosecutor Villefort. Years ago, Villefort's ex-wife Mina gave birth to a boy on a dark, windy night. After dismissing the midwife, Villefort cruelly buried the baby in a box within the fortress walls. All this was seen by the midwife hiding behind the tree. Recently, the midwife tried to blackmail Villefort, but he caught her and sent her to an asylum. The house where tragedy struck was Villefort's ex-wife's property, now abandoned and for sale. The Count knew this would be crucial to his revenge plan, despite rumors of it being haunted.
But the Count still wanted to know more about his former fiancée, Tess. Caderousse learned that Tess had been married to Fernand for 19 years with an 18-year-old son, Albert. This news pierced the Count's heart like a dagger. Tess was his only true love, now with his enemy and raising a child. The Count didn't know that Albert was actually his own son. Albert was in Italy with friends planning to attend the Rome Carnival. The Count decided to start his revenge in Rome using Albert as his entry point. He sent Caderousse to Paris to buy the abandoned house, while he headed to Rome with Jacopo. In Rome, they checked into a hotel and learned Albert couldn't rent a carriage. Jacopo, following orders, appeared and brought Albert and his friends to the hotel. The Count stressed to Jacopo to act natural, avoiding any suspicion that could ruin the plan. They had to make Albert and his friends feel comfortable to gain their trust. This was a key step in successfully implementing the revenge plan. Jacopo then informed Albert that the Count wanted to invite them to lunch. Albert knew nothing of the mysterious Count, but Jacopo said he was very important and generous. Hearing this, Albert agreed without hesitation. After all, who wouldn't want to meet such an influential figure? At lunch, the Count of Monte Cristo displayed exceptional charm and grace, preparing delicious dishes and engaging in lively conversation with Albert. During their chat, Albert inadvertently revealed their itinerary and desire to meet the refined ladies of Rome. This gave the Count an idea, and he devised a plan to address it. The Count learned that before the All Saints' Day celebrations, 2 criminals would be executed. He invited Albert and his friend to watch, mentioning his room had an excellent view of the square. Initially, Albert and his companion seemed uninterested, but the Count cleverly persuaded them, saying witnessing a person face death was a truly captivating experience that deepens one's understanding of life. He then offered to lend them a carriage for the carnival. Albert was thrilled, and at the Count's gracious invitation, after lunch, they went to the Count's room to watch the executions. The first to be executed was Peppino, a thief, who would be beheaded. The other criminal would be beaten to death with a hammer. Facing death, the criminals reacted differently, collapsing in fear and desperation. The Count remarked that this death couldn't atone for their sins. Albert looked puzzled, not grasping the Count's meaning. The Count explained, "Imagine someone causing you lifelong suffering. Such brief pain is far from sufficient. True punishment should be long-lasting, letting them suffer endlessly." This explained why the Count meticulously planned his revenge. He wanted his enemies to suffer, making their lives worse than death until his hatred was satisfied. Just as the executioner was about to behead Peppino, guards arrived shouting, "Stay the blade!" and delivered a pardon. This was all orchestrated by the Count of Monte Cristo using his extraordinary abilities, arranged well in advance. He saved Peppino because the man would be useful in his future revenge plans, while another criminal wasn't so fortunate and met his end under the executioner's hammer. After, the Count provided Albert and his friend with a carriage and carnival costumes as promised. His revenge plan began as Albert and his friend rode through Rome's lively streets, enjoying the carnival. Suddenly, a strikingly beautiful woman approached their carriage, engaging Albert in conversation. Albert was instantly captivated by her beauty, his heart racing. The woman, sensing Albert's interest, deliberately teased him, inviting him to join her. She gestured for him to follow. Love-struck, Albert told Franz to return to the hotel, then eagerly jumped out to follow the woman. He was lost in her charm, completely unaware of a masked figure following them closely. The woman led Albert to a secluded street, where 2 men suddenly appeared, knocking Albert unconscious. They quickly dragged him into a carriage and fled. That night, Franz returned to the hotel and was stopped by a man in black, who handed him a ransom note for Albert. Franz panicked, rushed back to his room and gathered all his money, but it wasn't nearly enough for the ransom. Desperate, he knocked on the Count's door for help. Franz anxiously explained that Albert's handwriting was on the note and the kidnapper was still waiting outside. The Count immediately called for Jacopo, prepared a carriage with firearms, and set out to rescue Albert. He confronted the kidnapper, demanding to know whose friend he'd taken. The man looked bewildered, clearly unaware of the Count's identity. When the Count revealed himself, the man paled, apologized, and led them to a castle outside the city. To everyone's surprise, the kidnapper boss saw the Count of Monte Cristo arrive and immediately greeted his people respectfully. The Count glared angrily at the fact that the other party had dared to kidnap his friend and demand ransom. The boss apologized again and hurriedly ordered his men to take Albert out. Then the Count asked Jacob to take Albert and the others to the carriage and wait for him. When they had left, the boss took off his mask, and it turned out that he was a friend of the Count of Monte Cristo. It was all a play they had planned in advance to make Albert trust the Count of Monte Cristo even more. On the way back, Albert curiously asked the Count how he had come to know the robbers. The Earl smiled and explained, "Once met a group of soldiers. They claimed to have gone to arrest Luigi and his gang, and he happened to meet Luigi's gang in advance. Kindly reminded them, let them hurry up and hide." Just like this, Luigi and the others narrowly escaped the pursuit of the soldiers. In order to thank him for saving his life, Luigi owed him a favor. When Albert heard this, Luigi was very sincere and he said that he would soon return to Paris. If he had the opportunity to go to Paris, he would be willing to be the head of the alley, and he could also introduce him to various figures of Paris high society. The Count of Monte Cristo secretly rejoiced in his heart, which was exactly what he had dreamed of. Soon after, Bourgeois came to Paris as he wished, and he moved to his daughter to buy 2 mansions, laying a solid foundation for his revenge in Paris. And the next step is planned, is to accept Albert's invitation, went to his home as a guest, thinking of the imminent meeting with Taisi, who he had in mind. Bourgeois' heart has mixed tastes. All kinds of complex emotions came to my heart. That night he tossed and turned and couldn't sleep. The next day, Bourgeois dressed up and arrived at Albert's house on time, and as soon as he entered the door, he was attracted by a portrait of Thais hanging in the hall. That was a portrait of Taisi 6 years ago. The years have left some traces on his face, but his beauty is still the same. Looking at this portrait, the Count of Monte Cristo's heart stirred. Mercedes' face was familiar, yet strange after years apart. Albert warmly welcomed the Count, saying his mother would arrive soon, but his father was detained by Senate business. Albert introduced 2 important figures, Mr. Beauchamp, editor of The Investigator, and Debray, secretary to the Interior Minister. Albert noted these men held significant sway in Parisian social and political circles. The Count sensed these 2 might play unexpected roles in his future revenge plans. Soon, Mercedes hurried in, her presence subtly changing the room's atmosphere. When the Count saw Mercedes, time seemed to stand still. He lost composure, holding her hand longer than appropriate when kissing it. Mercedes sincerely thanked the Count for saving Albert, then inquired about his life in Paris. The Count of Monte Cristo mentioned he just purchased 2 properties in Paris. Mercedes was surprised, but more shocked by how much the Count resembled her former love, Edmond. This moment of recognition left Mercedes internally flustered. She excused herself, claiming illness, and hastily departed. After the Count left, Mercedes eagerly asked Albert for the Count's real name. Albert admitted ignorance. In his carriage, the Count recalled meeting Mercedes. Tears welled in his eyes. Despite time's passage, their love remained undiminished. The next day, Caderousse brought news of a grand opera that evening, which the Movieclips and Villeforts would attend. Upon hearing this, the Count immediately ordered a carriage, deciding to arrange a special meeting with his 3 enemies at the opera house. In the opera house, commoners sat in the main hall, while the nobility occupied the upstairs boxes. Those with boxes were either wealthy or influential, and the box prices were exorbitant, out of reach for most, and sold as one-time purchases. Albert, seeing the Count of Monte Cristo, hurriedly introduced him to his father Fernand, who quickly took out his binoculars to observe this mysterious figure. Fernand was shocked to see the Count's box, as it had previously belonged to the Austrian ambassador, but was now purchased by the Count of Monte Cristo. This detail further convinced Fernand that this man was no ordinary person. From his box, the Count saw not only Fernand's family, but also the Grals and the Villeforts. His 3 enemies had gathered in one place. The Count felt a sharp pain in his heart, struggling to breathe. He suppressed his inner turmoil, quickly exiting the box for fresh air. With a splitting headache, he hastily took out his carefully prepared medicine, gradually calming down after taking it. Post-opera, Albert introduced the Count to his in-laws, the Grals. The Grals, having heard of the Count's reputation, were both curious and intimidated upon meeting him, feeling a mix of intrigue and awe. Little did they know, this refined Count before them was Edmond Dante, the man they had framed and imprisoned years ago. The Count calmly mentioned his plan to deposit 4 million francs in the Grals' bank. This statement drew mockery from the Grals, who doubted his claim to such wealth. Albert then introduced the Count to the Villefort family. Villefort too failed to recognize the Count, having forgotten his role in framing Edmond. After these brief encounters, the Count decided to initiate the next phase of his revenge plan. He planned to invite them to his country estate, asking Albert to convey the invitation. He would then send formal invitation letters. The next day, the Count sent Cadarus to bribe the asylum guards, aiming to rescue the midwife. However, the guards suddenly became busy, demanding double the bribe amount to release the midwife. Jacopo, losing patience, drew his dagger and swiftly dealt with the guards. Then the midwife was taken to Count Monte Cristo's country estate. She told the Count everything that happened that night and showed him where the baby was buried. The Count thought this would be a surprise for Villefort, who was coming to visit soon. Meanwhile, Inspector Beauville informed Villefort about the midwife's escape. He reported she took a knife, cut the guard's throat, stole keys, and fled. Villefort was furious and ordered the inspector sternly to find the midwife at any cost. This time, he'd send her to the guillotine, not the asylum, as mishandling this would affect his career and reputation. Soon, all received invitations from the Count, a great honor, and eagerly visited the estate. Villefort was very familiar with this villa. Upon arrival, he remarked on the extensive changes, while Gerard's wife, Mercedes, was shocked to see it because it was her parents' house. More importantly, she was Villefort's ex-wife, and the buried child was their own. The Count's estate was luxuriously and tastefully renovated, with rare antiques, books, and a fully equipped chemistry lab, knowledge imparted by Abbe Faria in prison. The Count enthusiastically shared his research on special plants that could heal or harm. Villefort's wife showed great interest, hoping for help with her often ill son. The Count sensed her thoughts and didn't hesitate to give her the potion. He discreetly told her how to use it, adding that he had an antidote on hand if needed. Suddenly, Villefort asked, "Does the horse tongs have an antidote?" The Count coldly replied, "Deadly poisons have no antidote." Was Villefort hiding an unspeakable secret? At lunch, the mood seemed light, but tension simmered beneath. Villefort subtly steered the conversation to Monte Cristo Island. The Count calmly explained it was an island near Italy. He bought the dagger from the Duke of Tuscany, hence his title, the Count of Monte Cristo. Villefort praised the house renovations, saying it was unrecognizable. The detective added that initially, no one wanted the house. The Count mentioned a scary story that scared off buyers. Villefort's heart skipped, but his wife was very curious. After lunch, the Count showed them the unchanged room. He spoke mysteriously, saying a terrible infanticide occurred here. Mina's face filled with pain upon hearing this. She could barely stand. Villefort's heart raced too. They both knew the truth. The unwanted child was born on this bed, then buried in a box under a tree. The Count led them to the tree, lying about an empty box found by the gardener. Villefort feigned calm, asking about the box. The Count said he burned it. Mina left, unable to bear it. Villefort angrily scolded the Count, who calmly replied it was Villefort's wife who insisted on knowing. Meanwhile, upstairs, the midwife identified Villefort and Mina as the child's parents. It turned out the child hadn't died. The midwife dug him out after Welford left. Mina wept bitterly. Welford comforted her, saying this wasn't the place to discuss it. Monte Cristo watched, smiling strangely. Welford was in her grasp, her revenge plan progressing. The Count of Monte Cristo's revenge plan was proceeding as expected. He confidently entered his enemy Glas bank, claiming to have a 10 million investment project in securities. But in exchange, as compensation, he needed 5 million in cash for himself. Since the man had changed so much, Glas didn't recognize him as the former Edmond Dante. As it seemed a profitable deal, she agreed without hesitation. Seeing he'd fallen for it, she quickly left to prepare the next step. She then went to the telegraph tower. While the worker was inside, she slipped a drug into their wine glass. The unsuspecting worker drank it, soon feeling dizzy, then collapsing directly. She entered the telegraph room to start her plan, which was to transmit false information. She sent out the content written on paper. The opposite station quickly responded. Then she safely woke the worker with an antidote. The worker didn't suspect anything, thinking they'd just drunk too much. Glas soon received information from her subordinates. A riot had broken out in Spain, urging to sell the securities quickly as stocks were rapidly falling. Though sudden, money matters, so she acted promptly. Just then, the man approached. Glas hastily asked if he held Spanish securities. Hearing this, the man smiled smugly. Her first step was to make him lose money, as bankers deal with money daily. Losing it was unacceptable to them. Next, she'd ruin his reputation. She had the innkeeper seduce his wife to obtain useful information and evidence of her crimes. She then gave this evidence to the press. Glar dared do this because she had government connections. This was how she made her fortune.